You do know that in the case of a rose garden, you know, people put a rose here and there and there and there and there. These are all like 4 or 5 feet apart, and they fill an area in with these roses. You know, you don't have a whole lot of choice on that. And they'll put big ones, flat ones, round ones, you know, all different types of rose bushes in an area, and they say, that's my rose garden. So you treat them all the same. And that's where people, you say, how do you prune roses? You just cut them down to about 10 inches high, and you get rid of, same idea with like cane, they're cane shrubs, right? So you gotta go in there with the loppers and cut out the really old, diseased or dying wood. You use the same sort of plan. Keep all the medium-sized wood that's nice and green and healthy. Little tiny scriggly branches, little scrawny ones, they can just come out if you want. You don't have to take them out, they're just living there. But cutting them right short. Why we cut them short is because roses, like other plants that bloom in the summertime, bloom on new growth. So anything that grows in the spring will produce flowers in the summer. So by pruning, you prune as hard as you want. They're going to shoot up and they're going to bloom every time. But the reality is when you're in this situation, you got to do it because you don't have the space. And those things, by the summertime, they're getting this high. They're already starting to crowd. You got to get in between. You got to weed and hoe in there or keep it looking tidy. And it's not easy because they're prickly. So rose gardens are not, you know, if you have a choice, right? You put them 5, 6 feet apart
in a row,
and in rows or whatever. Yeah, so you take care of them. So if I do a landscape design and I want a rose, I can plant a rose like a David Austin rose, which they're much hardier than say hybrid roses.
Is that like a perennial bloomer, like
they bloom? They're all different actually. You got to read everyone about when they bloom. A lot of them only bloom once, and that's it. So they bloom in the end of June and they're done. But other ones are ever blooming and they're fragrant, whatever their attributes are. But these are old-fashioned roses, so they're hardy. They don't need winter protection. Like all the hybrid roses need winter protection. But those roses, you can just plant one in and say that's a cane shrub, and treat it like those big cane shrubs and just let it grow. We've seen them. I've got a friend, his were 15 feet high, and they arced right over top of his walkway, and they were just like unreal blooms, like flowers, man. Like it was like a photo op every time you go there, right? And so, roses. How do you prune roses? Well, you look up the variety, and then you find out what the options are for that particular variety. And if you don't know what it is, you cut them down to 10 inches, and you go, I don't know, you cut through it. But when you do that, when you do cut it down, you look for the little metal tags, because they often have metal tags on them. And if you're lucky enough, there's still a metal tag on it, and you clean it off, look at it, take a picture of it, write the name down, and when you go back, write it in your book, and you know that's what that rose is. Note it, client, this is the rose I found there. And if it says HT, hybrid T rose, grandiflora, floribundas, whatever the type of rose is, then you'll know how to treat it. You know those roses need to be mulched in the wintertime typically, regardless of their hardiness. It just makes them healthier. So roses are pretty easy to do. Miniature roses are becoming quite popular, but miniature roses can get about this high. It's really the size of the bloom, right? It's not the size of the plant so much. They're skinny and scrawny and they don't have big canes, but they have little roses, and you can almost just hedge trim those things. Climbing roses grow up onto the trellis, wherever the trellis is, and that's whatever is supporting it. And you get the much better. Every year you'll have some sort of a trellis network in background that's holding your roses up. And whatever that trellis system is, your rose bush grows on there. They can grow way higher. Climbing rose is about 20 feet high, 25 feet. You know, that's sort of an average climbing rose. Two types of climbers. There's hybridized roses that are just like regular roses, and they put them on these supercharged root systems, and it just pushes, they're grafted onto a root that just grows like mad, super bigger, and it pushes that rose so hard that the thing grows huge. But they don't bloom very much because they're always in this constant vigorous state, right? Because they're growing big. But if you took a cutting off that and grew it, it would just grow like a little bush. But because it's on that supercharged root system, it pushes it. All the other climbing roses are natural climbers. Usually it'll say right on the tag. If you know the name, if it says Blaze Climber on it, you look it up and it'll say Blaze Climber is one of the first original climbing roses, or it'll tell the history of it, tell you that it is a true climber. So the whole issue is with climbers is they grow vertically quite easily. Most trellises should only be about 10 feet high. People say, how big is a rose trellis? And I always say it's about 12 feet high and about 15, 20 feet wide if they're climbers, right? But what normally happens is people buy these little tiny things that are 6 feet high, and then they put this climbing rose on it, and it just barely gets going, and it's already the top of the unit. So, and they need to be iron, like wrought iron, good and sturdy and solid, because the rose gets pretty big. So I do the same rule, is if I have a rose that's been there for years, first thing I do is go in and get rid of the big old woody stuff, get rid of it. Keep all the stems that are 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch size, ideally green in color. And I just keep a few of them, so if I have 15 stems on there, I can keep 5 or 6 or 7 stems and keep them on my rose trellis. And they usually grow quite big, so then I just cut them all off at about the top of my trellis, and ideally I'll train them so that they're all evenly spaced. And if you get the opportunity to manage your own rose, then you can do really nice work with it, and every year you come back to it, it's easy. When you come in, most cases you come in and somebody else has been doing it, and then they may or may not know any of this stuff, and then it can be a bit of a nightmare. And then you get a lot of these crisscrossing branches and stuff that are in there, and you're trying to figure out what's going on. So you want to just keep it vertical. And the whole concept there is that as soon as you cut the tops off, they start to branch horizontally, and they grow laterals. So the laterals grow, and climbing roses bloom on their lateral growth. They don't grow on the vertical growth. So it's just a real simple thing. Grow them up onto the trellis, attach them on the trellis, cut the tops, and when you cut the tops, they branch. It's like growing the antlers, but they branch all the way down. And everywhere you get a branch, you get a cluster of blooms. Most roses bloom once. Most climbing roses bloom one time. So by July, they're done. They bloom at the end of June, early July. Some of the ones, that's why they tried pushing some of these other hybrid roses to make them into climbers, because they have much longer bloomability. They just keep blooming. What I do is I don't usually use climbing roses. I just select really nice, like David Austin roses or something that's a really good ever blooming rose. It's just a normal rose, and I don't have to prune it. So I just put it on that trellis, grow it just like a normal shrub, like one of our cane shrubs. Just grow it up on there. I can cut it to the shape of it, train it on the trellis. Anything grows forward, just cut it off. And it's ever blooming, looks great. Normally they're about 8-9 feet high, like a normal David Austin rose, whereas the climbers are often way too big. We used to have clients that were 25 feet up. They'd cut them off at 22 feet every year, and they were just unreal. So then there are some shrub roses like Hansa rugosa roses. They're pretty common. And Hansa is really heavily thorned and stocky, and they have rippled leaves, and you see them used in boulevards. They're usually a big bushy rose with big purple flowers, very early blooming. So that's a really good rose. But what I do with those is I think of them as a humongous shrub. So year 1, I might cut them right down low to that maybe 1 foot high. Year 2, you cut them to about 3 feet high. Year 3, cut them to about 5 feet high. Year 4, maybe I don't cut them at all, so now they're getting to be quite big. Year 5, back down to the bottom, start them over again. You get like 3-4 years of growth. They just bloom on any new growth, so they're pretty good plant, pretty easy. So with roses, again, I don't think there's really much more that we really need to say about that, other than there are some disease issues with roses. The same rule, right? If you see diseased wood, cut it out. And those rugosa roses and wild roses, you see big black galls that grow on them sometimes. Sometimes the whole plant is so infested with these galls that you can't do anything about it. So you just have to let them go. Treat them well, give them compost, give them food, give them a little extra water. They should be fine.
What about a lot of older homeowners are really apt to making sure every cut is on a perfect 45 and that kind of thing. What's the
These are pruners, right?
Yeah. So there's no big rule with angle of cutting, like
no, but we just said that we know that the steeper the cut, the worse it is for the plant, right? So if I cut a really long, steep angle, it's going to open up a huge wound on that plant. The only thing that they say, like, if you want to get really particular, and I used to be really particular about rose pruning in the old days, but basically, the only thing that they don't want you to do is they don't want you to cut too close to a bud. So let's say there's a bud here on this rose, right? And there's another bud here, another bud down here, whatever. But if I'm going to cut above this bud, I don't want to kill that bud. So if I cut this off too close, like down here, that bud's dead for sure. But If I think that's a good bud, and it's one that's starting to grow, it's already initiated a bit of growth, as soon as they initiate, they're gonna bloom right away, right? They're gonna bloom fast. So rather than cut too close, I can cut up a little bit higher, but some people are concerned of that dying back too much and maybe developing some disease. So then they'll suggest to cut a little bit of an angle this way just to remove this little extra piece of wood. I don't think it really makes that much difference myself. I think you just cut it, but just don't cut too close to the bud. If you cut too close, the bud's gonna die. And so if you want that bud to live, if you cut it there and that bud dies, this one grows anyway. But then this whole stem starts to rot. And when it rots, it'll rot down into the center of the stem sometime. So, yeah, it's not really critical.
It's not as important as sometimes it's.
It's just with tea roses, you know, like there's some roses, and you hear all kinds of different stories about roses because they're all different. And tea roses have a single bud, a single bloom on each stem, and they're used as cut flowers. So you'll get clients who are like, no, these are my cut flower roses. And then you will want to pay attention a little bit to those buds that you're getting. You're training that one bud up because it's going to grow a nice long stem.
So they can go snip and they have.
They're going to cut a nice long stem. Usually a rose,
oh, yeah.
You're going to cut about 24, 26, 28 inches long. But any roses that grow in clusters, those are landscape roses. They're multifloras, what do they call them? They have a bunch of different names for them, but they're really just roses that grow in masses and bloom a lot. So all the meaty land roses, flower carpet roses, like with those, they bloom in big panicles of blooms. So the key is you got to cut the whole panicle off to get it to bloom again. You don't just deadhead it. You got to remove the whole panicle, right? Because the whole panicle is the bloom. So on a rose like that, like a flower carpet rose, they send out all these huge shoots. But on the end of the shoot is all the blooms, right? All your flowers are on the end there. And then you'll get another bud here that'll start to grow, and it'll grow up, and then it'll grow a bunch of blooms on that one. So you have to cut that whole panicle off. And that panicle can be quite long. But you know, with a lot of these meaty land roses, you could hedge trim them. You could just go in and hedge trim them. It's all about budget, right? If the client's got tons of money, they want you to be really particular. Go in there and take your little pruners and nip every little one off and do it perfectly, because they don't mind paying the money for it. But budget will rule, right? People are going to say like, yeah, you can do all these roses, but I got like $120, so go. Right? And you're like, okay, well, I know all these multifloras, the flower carpet roses, these things, let's just hit them with the hedge trimmer, or we just go in with these and we just boom, boom, boom. We only come here once a month, so we have to do a job on them, so you have to go in and cut a little extra off. And you come back a month later and they've all grown back and they're starting to bloom again, right? But, you know, other roses, you got to be a little more particular. So I just have to keep saying about roses is you got to know your variety of rose, so you know what to do. So, and that's, you know, the picture right here is just saying basically that is, you know, bad, and good. But the good thing is to make sure that you're not cutting too close, right? Yeah. And even now, I think since this production was, like I just know that on average, because I'm not specifically saying that this is a prunus or a rose or a mountain ash or whatever it is, but to be safe when they're cutting, when they're trying not to cut too close to the bud, go a little farther, because what happens is sometimes your pruners have diseases on them, right? And you might have a disease in there, and it's going to cause dieback. So if you're up a little extra, the tip might die, but it doesn't necessarily kill the whole branch. So anyway, I guess the space between the buds, the internode it's called, this space sometimes doesn't heal as well. Like all the growth comes from around the buds. So I guess that's why they want you to cut close to it, you know, so that you don't have a big chunk of dead wood sitting there. But you know, you can go up to 3/4 of an inch or an inch. And like I say, I would be using a nice sharp pair of loppers like this. Just go in and do my pruning really quick. I don't even have to bend over much, right, to get it. It's easier to do. And but again, when I do roses, I'll go through and I'll just chop them all off first. Then I go back, I look for the old wood, go inside with the loppers, cut a couple big chunks of old wood out. I'm pretty much done. And if I have bigger ones, I treat them just like a cane shrub, and I go, okay, well, there's one big old one in here, I'm going to cut that one out right at the bottom, pull it out, you know, look at the rest, shape it a little bit, leave it. If I got a lot of dead buds on the top, then I might use a hedge trimmer just to take the dead heads off. And that's it. Now with vines and things, vines are just another crazy world. But you know, the thing with vines are just don't cut them off at the bottom, right? I hate to say that. I had somebody one time. We had walls, like a huge wall of vines, and they were like huge and thick. And they started pruning them, and I told them to, I said, whatever you do, just don't cut any main stems, right? Because you can thin it a certain amount, but don't cut any main stems, because you cut one main stem, could be a 10, 12 foot swath of vine up that wall, right? And the whole thing's gonna die.
Is that like Oregon grape and stuff like that?
It's
or?
like English ivy or Virginia creeper or Boston ivy or any vine, like things like vines that creep on walls and stuff. And it seems like pretty common sense, but we all, if we're educated or if we know about it, we gotta watch the guys who maybe don't know, right? And we have to say, don't do it, just don't do it. And actually, I've even had some pretty experienced guys accidentally.
Clematis and passion fruit, those are good ones that can really trick you.
Yeah. Clematis look dead, and they're brittle too.
There's so many different
careful,
kinds
yeah.
that require different types of pruning, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so what I do with clematis is I usually use a hedge trimmer on them if I can, and I have just a system, because again with a clematis, what's the first thing you need to know? You need to know what type it is.
Yeah.
So you gotta know, and how many times do we know, right? Sometimes we do, lots of times we don't know. So we have a trellis, a side view. I'm using up all my pens here today.
Unless it's an evergreen. Yeah, mine did.
Yeah, we don't have any evergreen ones here.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they don't grow here. Okay, so there's your trellis, and you got your clematis growing up on there, right? So what happens with clematis is as they approach the top of the trellis, because again, they want to get like 15 feet high. Most people have little tiny trellises, so you get this really big buildup on the top, right? And then depending on the variety, they're either going to bloom on new growth, old growth, or whatever they're going to do. And I gave up on that years ago, because I just honestly, nobody knows, right? And you can look at it and you go, gee, it looks like a Jack Manning, it's purple, you know, and then you look in the books and you go, oh, there's like 180 purple ones and they're all different. And you're going, well, okay, so maybe it's not, I don't know what it is. But if you take the approach that if you know that this is all attached up inside here onto the trellis, and it's holding itself on, then if I take a hedge trimmer and I just do this cut off this blob, and I keep that, what happens is I'm encouraging a whole bunch of different things. I'm keeping old wood, so if it's an old wood one, it's going to bloom. I'm encouraging new growth, so if it's one that blooms on new growth, I'm going to get a good show. It's like, it's just called the happy medium, let's say. So the old hedge trimmer comes out, and I honestly, I just go stand beside the trellis, and I just go, take everything that's hanging off, and then I look at it, a couple snips, neat and tidy, done. It takes just a couple minutes. So clematis, yeah. If, you know, I think the thing that I found with clematis is that every once in a while you do get a really cool variety or something that maybe you planted, you know, you read up on it and you go, ah, okay, something cool, and you know about that one. You plant it in, and then you'll find some of them are not vigorous. Some are vigorous and some are not vigorous. If they're not vigorous, you're going to be a lot more gentle on it, because for it to grow a stem 3 feet long is a big deal. Other ones, not an issue. Tangutica is one of my favorites, but we cover entire like pine trees, right to the top in like 3 years. The whole thing. We had one that we had the Tangutica vine on it for about, I guess it was about maybe 6 or 8 years. And that thing was like absolutely just solid, a solid mass. You couldn't even see the pine tree anymore. And it was like a 100-foot high pine tree. It was just covered with these little yellow bell flowers. It was pretty crazy. And actually at the end they actually had they just cut the whole tree down because it was too much to handle, really. But it was kind of fun just to see that, you know, Tangutica is vigorous, right? Nellie Moser is common, but it's not super vigorous. You know, it's kind of slow and putters along. So, you know, you may not want to be cutting it too much. Whereas other ones like Jack Manny, there's one that's super vigorous, but you just hack it right to the ground and it just suckers up like crazy. And it grows huge again and blooms like mad on all that new growth. But by following that technique, you're going to get a reasonably good result, no matter what the variety.
Are you wisteria over here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wisteria are very easy to grow, but the key is constant pruning, right? So before you plant the wisteria, you got to think, oh yeah, okay, there's a vine that'll grow 75 feet high, and you'll have trunks as big as this, right? So you think, whoa, I'm not going to put it on a house. That'd be a mistake, because it's going to rip your soffits off. You're not going to put it on anything that has like regular lattice, right? We've had one of the first ones I ever pruned, and I knew all about them, but I always was in the plant industry. I was either growing plants, selling plants, buying, selling, training, teaching, or whatever, but not actually out pruning them much. I was back in the 80s. And then so when I actually had a client who had one, and she said, it never blooms, you know, and the thing was, it was like at least this big, huge stems. And the whole fence, it grew up through this fence and went onto this little lattice thing, this trellis, but the whole fence was completely ripped to bits. And the whole fence was kind of like, it bent outwards, and it was lifted off the ground, and one of the posts was ripped out. And it was just a disaster, right? And then, but it was okay, you know, and she was okay with it. She kind of, because when it grew, it got all covered with leaves. But the key with those is quite easy, and it's nice that actually you guys ask for those specific things, because it's so funny that so many times you get these plants and then people don't always know how to train them, right? And the thing with wisteria is it's very simple, is if you're in control and it's you planted it, you got a plan. Okay, so the plan is, I got a post, a 6x6 post, something nice and sturdy. It's gonna be tall, and it's gonna go horizontally or something, because I gotta deal with this vine. Every time a wisteria grows, what's the average length it grows in a burst? About 8 feet, if it's reasonably happy. It can go 15 feet in one burst of growth. So they're not a small vine, they're humongous. So the rule is with wisterias, and this, I have connections in high places. In England, they grow a lot of these things. And they always say there's only one way to grow them, right? Is you plant it in, you pick one stem. So you get all these stems when you buy it, that's a bad plant. A good plant only has 1 or 2 stems, and you remove one and keep one. So you train it up, the first year you grow it up onto your trellis, so you may have a really, you know, big, like I say, a big 6x6 pergola unit or something. Maybe you'll have something here that's going to train it. So you train your first shoot up to as high as you're ready till you figure you want it, so up to the next thing, and then you just cut it off. And you chop it off on the end. And when you chop it off, it starts to grow. The plant is constantly trying to send up shoots everywhere. So anything that comes from the bottom, you get rid of it. Don't let it grow. Keep one shoot. Side shoots come, that's okay, let them grow a little bit, and then cut the ends off them. And just keep nipping them back. Don't let them grow, that's okay. And each shoot up here, if it's not going where you want it, cut it off and get rid of it. Keep little stubs, always grow little stubs. And then you get one main one and you get it growing. So you're training literally one shoot at a time. And then it tries to grow like 10 shoots, so you cut them all off. Grow the one. And then when it gets to the end, you hit the end of your trellis, you cut end off. And you say, okay, that's it. That's it for wisteria, as far as you're going to go that way. So then when you do cut it, it's just like we were saying, you cut the end off a branch, it starts to branch out inside. So then it sends out more branches. And these branches will grow 6, 8 feet in a burst, right? 10 feet sometimes, if you get a vigorous one, 15 feet. Like a grapevine will grow 10 feet in a burst of growth. So what happens as soon as it starts to grow, you cut it off. And you cut it off, and then it grows some more, so you cut them off. And every time it grows, you cut them off. And it grows, you come back the next week, and you cut it off. And you leave stubs, right? And then it grows again, and you cut it back to a stub. And these little stubs here, you keep doing that, they start to mature, the wood gets more mature. And within just like 1 or 2 seasons, these buds here that start forming on these little shoots become bloom buds. And they start blooming right away. So then what happens is you get this tasseled effect with all your blooms on it, and then they bloom down the stem like that, anywhere you have these little stubs. But you don't ever let it dictate to you where it wants to grow, because it's going to rip this off, it'll rip the, you know, so we generally don't put them on houses, and we don't put them on anything of value unless it has some stability. If you go see some nice ones down at Boucher Gardens, down in Victoria, beautifully done, up a single post. And what they do there, and some of them anyway, they just grow straight up like a tree on a post, 2 branches, up another couple feet, 2 branches, up another couple feet, and they just grow up the post. Some of them are like 6 feet wide at the bottom, and then they'll go 6s, and 5s, and 4s, and 3s, and 2s, and 1s, like Christmas tree shape. And then when they bloom, they're just unreal. And they just bloom once, usually. They'll bloom sporadically in the summertime, but they're mostly a June flower. But they're always a photo op for sure. But the problem we have here is that there's different varieties, and many of them don't survive the cold winters. So you gotta have only the real hardy ones, which I believe are the Chinese wisterias. And so when you go to the garden centers, they'll have all these really cool ones, like if it sounds Japanese, like black dragon, that's a really cool one. It's like 4 foot long, dark purple blooms. It's just crazy. But if it sounds Japanese like that, probably not hardy. And they'll grow to be quite big. We had one out at one of our clients' places. They all died basically in the last year, and they were getting to be this big. But because last winter we had a minus 28 degrees Celsius, right, just for a day or two, but it just killed those things. Whereas all the Chinese varieties were fine; they came through no problem. But there's just a sensitivity when you get a cold snap. They really don't survive beyond about minus 20 degrees. So wisterias are interesting. It's like, I guess, silver lace vine is another one that's, you know, the insane vine. That's what they call it, malamin, right? I had a client one time. I was standing, we were way up on this balcony, and they grew the vine from the ground all the way up about 22 feet up, and then went right past the balcony and up to the roof, and it was still going up this line. We're standing way up there and going like, wow, this is amazing. This thing's growing. Like, you know, we were looking at it, was like 35 or 40 feet. And I was saying, that's just amazing. Like, when did you plant that? And he said, oh, we just planted it like this spring. And we're like, you're kidding. Oh, yeah, we were fertilizing it. It's like, yeah, I can tell. Like,
It's crazy how it wraps around the tree.
Everything.
oh yeah, and it'll choke trees. So vines on trees are not really recommended. And the trees get severely stressed by it. But, you know, if it's an old pine trees have that thick, heavy bark, so they can usually handle just about anything. But it can kill. The English ivy is the worst. It kills pines, it kills everything. It's really a deadly vine when it comes to those types of things. Yeah, so other, I guess, specifics when it comes to plants, and if you guys think of ones, anything specifically, just let me know. But you're really looking at that sort of the spring blooming thing. If it blooms in the spring, wait till after it blooms and do the trimming, unless doesn't matter. You guys will know when it doesn't matter. Sometimes you just have to trim something because it's just a mess or whatever. But it's really nice to positively identify the plants. And I always say, you know, start learning your plants, because every plant has a story and every plant has something that it does that might be slightly different than other plants. Like a beauty bush is something that's kind of a unique big cane shrub with pink blooms, colquitzia. Some of you might know that one. And it's just a very unique timing. It blooms in early summer. Late spring, really early summer, into sometimes right into summer, but then that's it for the year. So it's a little bit tricky. It's blooming on mature growth. And that's why, again, when you do this selective removal of branches, you're always leaving stuff there that might have been mature. Maybe there's some mature stuff, there's some immature stuff. So you're pretty much guaranteed a win-win every time with that technique. And some of the other things, like we talked briefly about barberries and that sort of thing. With those types of shrubs, what happens like a barberry or any a lot of different shrubs will do. Barberries are not really a cane shrub, you know, they're just sort of like a shrub. But a lot of plants do the same sort of thing. They develop rooting stems, are called stolons, right? So then whenever a thing grows out, it'll grow a branch, and then it starts to grow another shrub there. And that's what barberries do a lot, actually, is they send out these things and they start growing while they're trying to take over their space. So those are very easy just to go in and clip them out, remove those, take them off at the stem, and just get rid of the whole thing. Forsythias, really well known, they grow out and they reach down and they root into the ground. Dogwoods, you know, the Latin name is Cornus stolonifera. Thusly the name, that's what they do, right? They have stolons. So as maintenance people, that's often what we have to do, is make sure that we're not letting plants take over spaces where they're not wanted, right?
Azalea does quite a bit too,
Azaleas? Yeah, we don't have azaleas.
Really?
Yeah, the only azaleas we grow are the hardy versions. So they're deciduous azaleas. There's a few around. We see a few here and there, but they're not.
They don't do too well.
No, they don't. We don't have the humidity for them. You know.
No?
It's kind of it's a sad story. You know, they're so nice. But rhododendrons, there's a lot of rhododendrons
Yeah?
that we grow. Yeah. And rhododendrons are pretty easy to grow.
Mhm.
You just gotta have.
Not like
you gotta add new soils. Not like at the coast.
The
but there's
coast,
lots.
they're like trees.
Totally.
Well, there's some in Kelowna that are
Pretty big, yeah.
Did you get arbutus here, the strawberry tree here? No?
No arbutus. Can't handle the cold, eh? Yeah, it's one of these things, but that's again, like even with arbutus are amazing trees. And of course, when through horticulture training, we learned everything from coastal to you know, northerly plants. Arbutus are very cool because they have the ability to rejuvenate, regenerate from wood, literally. So you ever see a big burl on a tree, you know, right? You ever see that? Where you see people make tables out of burls, you know? It's this big swollen area on the side of a trunk. And they get to be quite massive, like in those ones, especially from on the arbutus, are the most beautiful, huge, weird, bubbly looking wood. Well, those, for years, those were always thought to be diseased tissue or damage, but now they know they're not. They're an organ that's designed to rejuvenate the tree. So burls are created by the plant to proliferate itself. So if a tree is going to die or fall over, the burl will grow, will continue to grow. And it's an organ. Now they know it's an advanced organ on certain species of trees. So it is interesting. There are other ones. They don't call them burls though, but there are diseased tissues, different types of rust galls and things that you find, like on pine trees. They get these big rust galls. Galls are different.
And eagle pines do it. Do you eagle pine do in here?
No.
Low growing? No?
No, we
Yeah,
don't
we got them out there.
Yeah, because of the humidity and the moisture and the disease organisms that are there. There's all kinds of things that cause those disease issues. So, you know, it's really, again, if you know the plant, so there's sort of, when it comes to pest and disease issues, that there's these two separate things. There's basically general pests that affect everything, and then there's species-specific pests. And that's where you become that next level up, right? You start learning all your plants really well, so you just know, you know, Hibiscus syriacus, I know Hibiscus family a bit, and what it does and what affects it. That's the next level, right? So that you can learn species-specific issues. And people say, well, it's a Douglas fir tree. Oh, yeah, okay, well, then I know it's going to have these 10 potential issues that are specific to Douglas firs, but not, won't affect blue spruce, it won't affect, you know, unrelated species. But that's all good. But, you know, pine beetle. Everybody knows what that is. But you can see in the outside, and people say to look for sap running, but you don't really see any sap in most cases when you see pine beetles. What you'll see are these little tiny holes. So it's really good to identify that you won't see sap in most cases. And that you'll hear about it, and people will say, gee, my pine's got sap gobs on it. Well, there's tons of insects that will cause sap gobs, but pine beetles don't always. And most pines, especially if they're under moisture stress, they don't have enough juice or sap or pitch to ooze out any sap. But it's sure obvious once you get inside. It's like, you know, the tree's dead. And the reason the trees will be dead is because the root system is unable to get any food, right? Because we talked before that the leaves produce the sugars, and they come down under the bark through the cambium down into the root system, and then the water comes up in the nutrients through the wood, and that's exactly what happens. It girdles the tree. There's no more cambium layer. The tree's toast. So when you're doing pruning, these are things you sometimes will discover. You'll cut into a tree and you go, oh my God, you know, like this tree's toast, and you have to be able to make that call. Symptoms like the woodpecker holes in this thing, that's also a symptom of pine beetle. Because the woodpeckers know where the insects are.
Fruit is.
Yeah, and that's why there's so many woodpeckers around, right?
That woodpecker cuts square holes though, that's kind of weird.
Yeah, well they've got a miter beak, miter beak woodpecker. Yeah. But those are kind of cool things. This was just an interesting root, and this is an example of something that came out of a pot, right? It was a 1 gallon juniper that was planted.
Oh man.
And that's what, whenever we see, you know, what's the life expectancy, right? Like this was planted probably,
Decently old.
yeah, it got about almost 20 years old. But then all of them are dying. People say, oh, what's wrong with these things? You know, all my junipers are dying. So right away, first thing you think, you know, mouse damage, first thing, right? So you go and check and the stems are, and on this one there were stems that were gnawed. And you can see, oh, there's lots of mice in there. So maybe that was one of the issues. But then as soon as we had to dig one out to check to see what was going on, it came out, and you can see that's a 1 gallon juniper little pot, right? So I've said before how important it is that when you buy plants that come out of pots, that the roots never move beyond that pot, they only get bigger. So that completely choked that tree off. and this actually was a spreading juniper, it was flat to the ground. So flat growing species sometimes root a bit as they go, so they have that secondary ability to pull up moisture and nutrients from their stems. This is what you get when you get a regular shade tree too, right? And why they don't have a really good prognosis. But you can tell, you know, when you look at trees, when you're out pruning trees and things, you're looking at that general health and seeing what's going on. Last time we actually went out and looked at the tree, and we looked at the little scars on the branches to kind of get a feeling for what the growth extension is. You're getting good growth extension on the trees, you know that you're getting reasonably good health. You're getting reaction, the roots are working, everything's working. The leaf size, big leaves, means healthy trees. Little leaves, you can get it on the same tree. 2 branches with huge leaves and the rest are all small, right? That's our disease issue, right? On this tree, this branch here, this was the main trunk at one time. The main trunk got diseased, so these leaves were teeny little leaves. This thing, huge strong stem with great big maple leaves on it. Like it was really blatantly obvious, right? So we look at that as a symptom of health and we go, well, you know, we gotta cut out this stuff. Let this one grow and it's got healthy tissues and it's gonna fill in. You know, you take a tree that's really nicely shaped and you cut half of it away sometimes, right? Because it's diseased or whatever. You come back 5 years later and you never know that tree was ever trimmed or pruned. It just looks like a perfect tree again. But it's having the courage to do it. Because, you know, you think, oh, what's the client going to say if I cut half this tree away? I had a problem with that last year where we had 2 trees, one on each side of the entranceway of a house, right? And both maple trees, both exactly the same. One of them had symptom of verticillium wilt. And I told the client, I said, this tree's got verticillium and it's not a good thing. And I told him the sad story that it's probably going to die. And so the season goes on, it still looked okay, and then it started to fade, and then literally overnight, in about probably the middle of September, dead. The whole thing. This is like a trunk like this. It's a red maple, one on each side of the entranceway. This one, dead, and I mean crispy dead. So got rid of it, but it was just, you know, it was just a sad event. It really was. But the thing with verticillium wilt, and I'll just go back onto that just for 1 second, is that there's 2 common species of verticillium wilt. One of them is really, really aggressive, and one of them is kind of sputters along and doesn't really kill the plant. It just makes it look crappy for years, and it's a struggle for the thing. But sometimes they even outgrow it. So just because you do see these symptoms of verticillium, I always say that, you know, you see them Japanese maple and it's going crispy or it's not healthy. You know, you cut out the stuff that's dead. You know, you do your best to keep it going. You always use some nice compost around it because that's always a health thing for the tree. And then you watch it grow. Maybe it comes back. And I've had a couple come right back because it had the slower growing variety of verticillium. The maple that I just explained to you that died fast was the fast growing variety. And they're completely different species.
Are their visual symptoms pretty similar?
They're exactly the same,
Oh.
but it's way faster.
Yeah.
I mean, way faster. Like you get a dead branch on a tree and you cut it off, you come back next year, not too bad. Oh, there's another dead branch, you cut it off. It's not really doing too much. Or you get a big branch that dies, you cut it off, and then the tree comes back and it's good for a couple more years. So that's the slow acting one. The bad one, it's like filling all the sieve tubes with fungus and it just kills the tree. And then you know that here you've got 2 trees. How big are the root systems of those trees, right? Trunk like that. It's probably about 40 feet in diameter, 15, 20 feet out from that trunk, all the way around radius. And you got 2 trees that are 15 feet apart. Those roots are intermingled underneath the driveway, right? So how long's that other tree got before it gets it? You know, and how does it spread, right?
How do you get the stump out?
How do you get the stuff up? Excavator, absolutely. But then the chunks of soil, right? You take that soil and then you carry it across the yard and it's dropping all over the ground. Everywhere that soil drops, you're dropping the verticillium fungus, right? So it's a powerful tool to understand that, but it's really wise. That's why we always say, like in landscape designing, it's a whole combination of things that we're using. But with trees themselves, the rule is not to go with more than 10% of any one species on any one property. So you've got variety. In nature, you've got quite a bit of variety happening in a given area. And that's what we need to do in the landscaping, is that whenever we do monocropping, it happens in orchards all the time, right? Diseases come in and it causes a major issue through the whole orchard. But if you had all assorted varieties, you might lose a few trees here and there, but you're not losing your entire crop. And with especially the larger communities and larger properties, you gotta keep mixing it up all the time. And then you're not likely to have a problem, because you can imagine if you had a verticillium outbreak in a small neighborhood, and you had tons and tons of maples and stuff in that neighborhood, and lots of smoke bushes and what other plants that are commonly affected. I mentioned the red bud. All the horse chestnuts, highly susceptible to verticillium. So, if you had just happened to start getting groups of these trees all in one neighborhood, they were all subject, the whole neighborhood goes down. Like everything goes down. Like it's crazy. So, having that knowledge is a next step up, where you can start to pick and choose and say, well, we're going to have lots of verticillium resistant plants in with the maples and with the smoke bushes and stuff. And if they happen to be affected somehow, then we're not going to lose everything, right? But it's very, very common. The other problem that we have with verticillium is that often we buy plants and they come with it, right? So you go to nurseries, especially in coastal areas, they have these massive, huge areas filled with Japanese maples. And we go through those areas and we notice the symptoms, that they've got it in their soil. And every year they replant, right? So they gotta have the knowledge to keep mixing them up and rotating their crops around. So that's why some nurseries are better than others at growing plants, because they're got a completely different level of knowledge for sure. So the 3 Ds, dead, disease, and dying wood, and that's really the key. As I mentioned, that when I do pruning, that's what I do, is I go in and I look at the tree first, I look at all the plants, the shrubs, get rid of the old stuff, get rid of the dead, disease, the dying wood, and assess the plant's health at that time. Look at the bud scale scars, because every year we went out and actually looked at bud scale scars out here, and if anybody wants to just have a look at that before we go today, that would be probably a good idea. Bud scale scars are a pretty easy way to tell how much growth a tree gets every year, because in the wintertime, when fall sets in, all the buds that are on the tree are protected by these scales that keep them from freezing in the wintertime, keep them from desiccating, and then in the springtime when it grows, the bud scales fall off, but it leaves scars around the trunk, around the branches. So it's really easy to see, and if you go out and look at other trees, especially on maple trees, but you can go and have a look at those, and you can see the growth extension every year, and you got a pretty good idea of the health of that tree. We identified the tree out here that it looked like it was long. They were pretty long when the tree was planted, and then the next year it was shorter, and the next year shorter, and the next year shorter, and the next year shorter, and then last year almost nothing, right? So that tree's on its way out, right? Or it's struggling. What's it going to be next year? Is it going to turn right around and put on a foot of growth, or is it going to just finish off and die? So again, when we're pruning, we can tell that stuff. We know the health of the tree. Bigger, older trees, though, do slow down, right? And that's something you don't know until you get out there and start pruning. You get into a big old tree, if you get that opportunity to get up in a tree and do some pruning. It's pretty cool. You get to learn that tree. But you also realize that the growth habit of older trees is different than vigorous young trees. Vigorous young trees can put on 5, 6, 8, 10 feet of growth a year, whereas older trees, not so much. They slow down and they don't put on as much growth, but they should always be growing a reasonable amount. Even a really old tree should be putting on 6 inches, a foot of growth at least every year all the way around. But through that first 20 years of that tree's life, they can put on some major footage. So that's the whole thing I was saying about trimming these trees that are in the wrong spots. People just trim and trim and trim. And then the rules with disease issues with the density of the branches. Like when you go in and prune a tree, and it's really important to know whatever the tree is. Let's say this is a tree, it's got branches. You say this is the tree. If you're in there and you're pruning that tree, what happens is there's all these little branches inside, all these little ones. And then you see an amateur pruner, somebody who's just learning how to prune. The very first thing that they do, they get up inside that tree and they clear out all these little branches, right? And you'll see they'll open it up and it looks so cool, because there's no branches inside of it. And they leave only the branches on the outside. But remember that every part of this tree, everywhere there's bark, there's got to be growth under that bark. That bark needs food supply, so it needs leaves. So an experienced pruner will go in and they'll just remove the dead wood, and they'll try to leave a fair bit of branches here and there. They can thin them out a little bit, but you always leave growth all over each branch. Each trunk needs a few branches here and there to feed that trunk, right? It's just an added food supply. So again, that's something when you start doing real pruning where you're somebody says, here, go for it, see you later, and you go up in a tree, you wear a harness or something to make sure you don't fall out of the tree, and you have your scabbard, and you have your hand saws, and your folding saws, and your pruners, and your loppers, and pole saws. You've got the full gamut of gear up there.
That's good.
Yeah, chainsaw, yeah. But when you get up in the tree, right, and then things really, you do a couple trees like that, and it's a lot of fun. It's a big learning thing. But after you do probably about 3 trees, it changes your whole opinion on how to prune, really. But it's nice to have sort of a little bit of this before you go up there, because when you get up there and you start finding bad stuff, you know what the priorities are. But the whole thing is not to take away too much. If you only have 20% maximum as far as removal, and generally big branches, you don't take them off. And that's just it's the last of the last of the last thing you do is cut off anything that's of any size. Branches up to this big, you're starting to question whether you're going to take those out or not. So really, really important that we not cut out big branches. And if in doubt, you always call in the most knowledgeable arborist that you know, and have them come in and